Mr. President, I rise today to speak to the bill that's before us with regard to the Iran negotiations. I want to address two fundamental and major segments of this process. One is process, and the other is the substance of the agreement, which hopefully will come before this body at the end of June or July. First is process. We're operating, Mr. President, in a constitutional gray area. There is no question that the Constitution assigns principal responsibility for the conduct of foreign policy to the President. But it also assigns responsibility to the Congress, responsibility with regard to treaties, responsibility with regard to funding the foreign policy of the United States, responsibility with regard to approving foreign policy officials. So there is an opportunity here for us to break, in a sense, new ground to establish a rational, formal, predictable process for considering this important issue. If we don't pass a bill such as the one that's before us today, we're in a kind of disorganized, chaotic situation of what will be the congressional reaction, what is the Congress's role, how will it be played out, how will it work, and I believe that it's very important for us to establish this process before the agreement is laid before the world and the American people. It sets forth a process whereby Congress can weigh in a meaningful way and determine the merits and the quality of the arrangement that's being set before us. Mr. President, I can't imagine a more solemn responsibility for this body than the consideration of this matter. This is a decision which will affect the United States, our ally Israel, all the countries of the Middle East for generations to come. This is a consideration that must be taken on the merits, on the facts, on the data, on the actual alternatives, and I'll talk about that in a moment, on the alternatives that we have to the deal, the arrangement that's ultimately, we hope, brought to us later in this summer. Let's treat it on the merits, and please, to my colleagues, let's not treat this as simply another partisan issue. We have a tendency around here for everything to become a partisan issue. A great Republican senator of the 50s said, politics should stop at the water's edge. And that means that this kind of issue that involves war and peace, that involves ridding or preventing a major country from obtaining nuclear weapons and thereby destabilizing the region and possibly the world, is the most solemn kind of issue that we can face. And I know that there are people in this body who are not supportive of the president, who are opposed to the president, who don't like what he did in healthcare or don't like what he did in immigration. But this is not a place for partisan politics. That doesn't mean that I'm saying we should just roll over and do whatever the president says. I don't mean that at all. What I mean is, this matter should be considered in the context of the facts and the merits. What will it actually do, and what are the alternatives? Not on whether or not we agree with this president or whether or not we want this president to have an international accomplishment on his resume. We have to try to separate ourselves from that kind of consideration. Now, let's talk a bit about the agreement itself. Now, the first thing to say about it is it doesn't exist yet. It's not finalized. We don't know what it is. So I'm a little surprised, frankly, Mr. President, when I hear many of my colleagues saying it's a terrible deal, it won't work, when we don't even know what it is. We have a framework, that's true. And interestingly enough, many of the same people who are saying this is a terrible deal were the same people that said that the Joint Plan of Action a year and a half ago was terrible, a historic mistake. It turned out it was a very important step toward an agreement and essentially froze Iran's nuclear program for the past 18 months. So let's take a deep breath and reserve judgment about whether this is a good deal, a bad deal, or something in between until we actually see what it is, until we actually see what is signed. Hopefully there will be something signed. We don't even know that for sure. Clearly, the interim or the framework agreement that was announced a few weeks ago is an important step in this process. It gives us some information, but it doesn't give us the all-important details. So point number one is, let's do ready, aim, fire, not ready, fire, aim. Let's understand what it is that we're debating and talking about before we fill the airwaves with rhetoric about whether this is a good or a bad deal. Secondly, it has to be a good deal or we should not approve it. If the deal is illusory, if it's structured in such a way that Iran has a clear path to the bomb and that it wouldn't slow them down and in fact would facilitate it in some way, clearly we shouldn't approve it. Clearly it should not be before us. So we start with the premise, I start with the premise that A, we should hold our fire until we see what it actually says, and B, it has to say the right things. It has to affirmatively stall, delay, prohibit Iran's path to a nuclear weapon, and it must be totally verifiable. Ronald Reagan, of course, said trust but verify. In this case, it's don't trust and verify to the nth degree. Verification is the heart of the agreement, I would submit, Mr. President, and it has to involve technology, people on the ground. It has to involve an openness to inspections that is unprecedented. Because we have the experience of North Korea where we had a kind of agreement. It turned out it wasn't sufficient. And in fact, they moved toward nuclear weapons by cheating. We cannot make that mistake again. And verification is the heart of it. And it has to be as vigorous and as intrusive as is necessary in order to assure us and the world that Iran is not cheating and is not moving in any way, shape, or form toward a nuclear weapon. In this regard, Mr. President, I think we are extraordinarily fortunate in this moment of history where this particular negotiation is taking place, that one of the President's principal advisors, the Secretary of Energy, happens to be a nuclear physicist. I don't know if we've ever had a nuclear physicist in that position before, but he is uniquely positioned to understand the details and the implications and the alternatives that can help us to assure that this arrangement provides the protection that we believe must be the case. In assessing this arrangement, whatever it is, I start with the premise it has to be solid, verifiable, and meaningful. It cannot be just window dressing. It has to stop Iran's progress toward a bomb and create at least a one-year breakout period so that the other alternatives can be exercised if they start moving in that direction. But in order to assess that deal, it's imperative that we also assess alternatives. We can't just say, well, this is good or bad. It has to be compared to what? And there are really only two alternatives that I can see. One is if we don't make this arrangement. One alternative is more severe sanctions, more sanctions. And some people throw that out as if it was easy. As Shakespeare would say, it comes trippingly to the tongue. More severe sanctions. What's missed in this discussion, Mr. President, though, is that we're not the only player here. This is not Barack Obama and the Supreme Leader. This is not the United States and Iran. This is 5 other major countries, members of the Security Council of the United Nations, major countries who are involved in this whole discussion in this negotiation, but most importantly, Mr. President, they're engaged in the sanctions. Our sanctions are important, no doubt about it. But it's not our unilateral sanctions that are necessarily providing all of the pressure on Iran. In fact, an argument can be made that it's the reluctance and the participation in the sanctions of other countries in the world, not only in the P5+1, but other countries as well, that are not buying Iranian oil, for example. We haven't bought Iranian oil for 35 or 40 years. But people who aren't buying Iranian oil are countries such as China and India and Japan. And it's their decisions that are contributing to the pressure that's brought Iran to this negotiating table. Now, if the world decides that this is a sufficient deal, that it does sufficiently restrict Iran, that the verification is as vigorous as it needs to be, if the world decides that and we say, the heck with you, we're walking away, and they decide that we have taken that step unilaterally and against their best judgment of what this deal means for keeping Iran from a nuclear weapon, then the sanctions regime starts to fray. And indeed, it starts to unwind. And we can do all we want. We can stamp our foot and do more sanctions, but if the rest of the world is not with us, it's not going to be effective. So the idea that somehow in this body, in this Congress, in this city, we unilaterally can make the decision to impose additional sanctions that will bring Iran to its knees and the rest of the world doesn't agree with us, that's not a valid observation. So it's not so easy to say, oh, well, the alternative here is if we don't like this deal, we'll just go to more sanctions. Now, if the other members of our negotiating team group decide they agree with us that it's not a good deal, then sanctions will continue and indeed probably strengthen. But I don't think we should feel that we have this kind of unilateral, the heck with the rest of the world, we're going to do this ourselves. I think that's a very important point to understand, that we are part of an international community that's negotiating this deal, and other members of the community, what they're doing in the way of sanctions are important as well as our sanctions. Of course, the other alternative is military. The other alternative is some kind of strike. Some kind of strike. And there are various estimates that I've heard in various forums and settings, but the most common estimate I've heard is that we could destroy their entire atomic infrastructure. We could level the buildings, destroy all the centrifuges, and we will have set back their nuclear weapons program by about 2 to 3 years. But what if we did that? We've set it back by 2 to 3 years. We can't erase the knowledge that they have. We've simply erased their infrastructure. The infrastructure can be rebuilt, and two things will have changed. Number one, they will have the knowledge, and number two, they'll never ever negotiate. And number three, we will have created enemies of an entire new generation of Iranian people. We will have alienated those people to the point where it will be impossible to negotiate, and we will be in a situation of some kind of military intervention as far as the eye can see. The military option has to be on the table. The president has to retain that option, and he has. But I think we have to be realistic about what that option means and the commitment that it entails, both from us and our allies. I'm not saying that it's off the table. I'm not saying that it would never happen, but what I am saying is we have to assess the negotiated arrangement in light of the realities of either the deterioration of the sanctions regime or the realities of facing military action. Finally, Mr. President, I know as this debate continues, there are going to be a series of amendments. And a lot of those amendments are going to be appealing. For example, as part of the condition of the deal, Iran shall recognize Israel's right to exist. Or as part of the negotiation of the deal, Iran must forswear terrorism, or the president has to certify that Iran forswears terrorism. Those are desirable, but they'll never happen. Iran will not agree to those. So when you propose an amendment like that, what you're really saying is, we don't want an agreement, because that's never going to be something that they're going to accept. I would submit, I think Iran is a mischievous, that's a too light a word, a dangerous country in terms of exporting terrorism. We see it throughout the region. There's only one thing worse than an Iran that is attempting to support terrorism and destabilize regimes in the region, and that is Iran that is supporting terrorism, destabilizing the region, armed with nuclear weapons. We can't solve all the problems of the region in this agreement. The purpose of this agreement is to keep Iran from achieving a nuclear weapon. That's what we have to keep our eye on. And if amendments, no matter how desirable, no matter how good they sound, no matter how politically appealing, if those amendments will effectively undercut or effectively eliminate our ability to keep our eye on the main ball, which is to keep them from having nuclear weapons, those amendments will not serve us, our interests, Israel's interests, the Middle East's interests, or the world's interests. We've got to focus on what it is we're trying to achieve. And what it is we're trying to achieve is incredibly important. A nuclear-armed Iran is a danger to the region, and it's a danger to the world. And right now, I think it is a very pivotal moment as to whether or not we're going to be able to achieve a realistic agreement that will make that less likely. Now, it may be that the agreement that we agree to, that goes into place, doesn't work, that they cheat. I would submit at that point, we're right where we are now. We can then talk with the rest of the world about additional sanctions. We do have the military option. We're no worse off than we are if we at least try to achieve the resolution of this grave issue through diplomacy, negotiation, and working with the rest of the world to try to eliminate this one problem. We're not going to eliminate all the world's problems in this one arrangement or negotiation, but if we can keep Iran through this process from achieving a nuclear weapon, from aspiring to a nuclear weapon, then we will have achieved something important for ourselves, for the future generations, not only of the Middle East, but of America and the world. And Mr. President, before I close, I want to at least share my thoughts on the role of Chairman Corker and Ranking Member Cardin in bringing this matter to us in a thoughtful, responsible, deliberative way. This is the way the Senate is supposed to work. Committee consideration, debate, discussion, review of amendments, and bringing a bill to the floor for discussion and debate. And I want to acknowledge the work of the senator from Tennessee, who has taken this so seriously and who is doing it in the best traditions of this body. So, Mr. President, I think we are embarking upon an important and solemn project here that can have enormous ramifications for ourselves and our posterity. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.